If the TTB were to come back and say, like, upon further review, sure, it's not a vintage date, but it's truthful and accurate information, and you can put it on the label, and other cider makers can do the same, then I don't know if we would still have a case.
Hello, my name is Rio Windcaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world.
Hip, hip, hooray!
Bringing us into episode 488 of Cider Chat was Ron Extract of Garden Path Fermentation, which is based in Washington State. He was talking about the inability for cider makers to be able to put the actual harvest year, or in the wine world, we would hear it as vintage, on the label of a bottle. Right now, if you're producing a cider at 7% alcohol by volume, you cannot let consumers know the year that those apples were harvested. So let's say, for instance, 2025 is just a fantastic year. The sun was right. There was just enough rain. Everything was perfect. That means any fruit collected that year has a really good shot at making fantastic cider. The rest is up to the cider maker, of course. But, that year with the apples, the harvest is key. And as a consumer, when we're making purchases, and if we're in the know and we're all jazzed up about following the weather patterns and how that's impacting the agricultural trade, in this term, or in this way, orchards, right? We would want to know the year that the harvest was. And right now, you can't do that. So it impacts producers, it impacts consumers, and it also impacts anyone sending product into the United States. Labels are really, well, boy, they could be contentious, and they're governed by the government in a way that can really stifle commerce. So you're going to be hearing from the guy who really spearheaded this to get it hopefully resolved. And as he was saying, the easiest way is for them to say, hey, yeah, I don't even know why we're doing this. Let's move it forward. Fingers crossed. But as we know, the halls of, the Capitol move slowly. So we will see how it goes, and we'll be following along. But he's our featured guest, Ron. You're going to be hearing from him shortly. But first, as always, we have a wee bit of news from out and about in Ciderville. I know David Lugo, better known as the Laughing Pommelier, and he contacted me to let me know that on February 6th, there is going to be a band called The Whistlers, and they have been writing songs all on cider, and they'll be showcasing these at the show that's going to be taking place at the Fett Music Hall in Providence, Rhode Island. Doors open at 7 p.m. The show starts at 8, and they are the opening act for a band called the Debutantes, which is a Indiana bluegrass band. You could get tickets at the door. You could get them online. I'm going to have a link in the show notes. And we're going to hear two little clips of two different cider songs, Hot Apple Cider, and the second one is called Cider Verse.
I drank a whole crock pot of hot apple cider. Rolled myself a J, but I lost my lighter.
Oh, me, oh, my, oh. Okay, it's going to be a fun night. That was the Whistlers singing a little clip from Hot Apple Cider. The next clip is called Cider Verse. And once again, they are the Whistlers. They'll be playing at the Fett Music Hall in Providence, Rhode Island on February 6th. You'll find links to the tickets in the show notes for this year, episode 488.
I am a tree.
I'm from the forest. And sometimes people plant me in a row. And on my bridge, I'll make some apple. For apples are my favorite thing to grow.
I love that last line. Apples are my favorite thing to grow. Yeah. Bring on the cider songs. Cheers to the Whistlers. And if you're in Providence, Rhode Island, next week, definitely check it out. This is going to be a fun event. And Lair's Cocktails, you're going to be in for one heck of a time. Coming up in April on the 18th is the Hungarian Cider Salon. And that means you get to go to an event that has the makers there serving their wares, and you're going to be seeing Eastern Europe makers and further afield too. I know that there's going to be some makers there from the UK, I think specifically Tom Oliver. So this is going to be an amazing event. It's going to be in the city of Pécs, which is spelled Pecs, pronounced Pécs. And from everything that I've been studying about it, it sounds like a beautiful, beautiful city. In fact, Hungary is probably a really great place to travel to for so many reasons, because it's really exotic in a romantic kind of architectural way. And they have cider. So you're seeing this gal, if you're watching this on YouTube right now, her name is Ansha Gurgly. She has spearheaded this cider salon, and she has been on the podcast. I've had her on the French cider tour, most recently the UK cider tour, and I will see her again in Hungary. That's April 18th, and I hope to see you there. Links in the show notes for tickets. So we have the cider salon on the 18th of April in Hungary, and then about a week later, starting off on April 27th, is the 2026 UK Blossom Time Totally Cider Tour. Yeah, we're going to be in the UK, in the West Country during Blossom Time, going to Somerset and enjoying some of the amazing producers down there. First of all, I could go into all the particulars on where we're going to go, but I just want to say, being with the people on this tour is like really like the biggest part for me. It's where I get to meet folks who have been listening to the podcast. We have the same kind of sense of humor because, you out there in Ciderville are tolerating me. And we have the same like vibe of wanting to enjoy cider, talk about it, not go overboard and get too wasted on it, because we're on vacation. We're enjoying ourselves. It's holiday time in the UK with glasses of cider, bottles of cider from amazing, amazing producers. There's just so much going on there. And I just love experiencing that area with folks. So the people on the tour is a plus. And if you've been thinking, oh, I want to do a tour, well, I just want to think about those like little memes that you see out there where my friend invited me on a tour, and I'm so glad I took them up on it, because that's kind of like what these tour experiences are. You think, oh, can I go on a tour? Is there something that's like interesting to me? I'm going to be bummed out because I'm not in control of my time. Well, you are in control of your time. There's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of time for you to just be in the experience on your own. But it's also a time to really be able to recharge. And even myself as a tour leader, I get to recharge too, because we're all set up once we're there. We don't have to worry about where we're eating, the menu, how that's set up for our particular diet needs. And then we're just meeting with makers who are totally jazzed too. So yeah, if you want to find out more about the UK Blossom Time Tour or the upcoming French Cider Tour in September, reservations are now open. There are some seats left on the UK Cider Tour, so you could still get on, but please don't put that off because April's almost here. I don't want you to miss out. I had to close it last August when I led the tour, so please don't hesitate. I know if any time, this is the best time to get away and just clear your head and take in other parts of the world. If you are in your own special spot of Ciderville, there's just no better health thing to do. So yeah, go to ciderchat.com, look up the Totally Cider tab there, and it'll give you all the details, or send an email to info@ciderchat.com.
Walking through the orchard.
Up next is our featured presentation on a pending lawsuit spearheaded by Garden Path Fermentation, which could change how cider makers label harvest year and vintage on cider over 7% alcohol by volume. So grab a glass and join this chat with Ron Extract of a Garden Path Fermentation based in Washington State.
That we're very much an agricultural producer. Everything that we source comes from our immediate surroundings. We use all locally grown ingredients. We do all native yeast fermentation. So our cider, our wine, our beer, all of it carries a sense of seasonality, and being able to convey that is kind of part of our core identity. I'm just going to preface it by saying that I'm not an attorney, so I can't, speak too much to the detailed legal side of things, but as plaintiff and, person who is involved in the case, I'm happy to address any questions.
You're out in Washington State, and you are setting up quite a precedent here for the cider community. There's a lawsuit out on in terms of vintage labeling. So for listeners who are hearing this the first time, maybe you could give us a little idea about what this lawsuit is asking to change here for cider. And you are a cider maker at Garden Path Fermentation.
Yes, we actually make cider, wine, and beer. So we do a little bit of a lot of different things. And this issue hadn't come across my radar until fairly recently, because cider is broadly classified as wine in the US, and all wine is regulated by two different government entities, depending on how strong it is. If it's 7% or above, it's regulated by the Tax and Trade Bureau, which also oversees labeling of beer and distilled spirits and all other alcoholic beverages. But if it's under 7%, then it's primarily regulated by the FDA, which is just kind of a weird idiosyncrasy in federal regulations. And up until this point, all of the cider that we've made at Garden Path has been under 7%. So we've been under FDA jurisdiction, which requires adhering to quite a long list of rules, but does not require pre-approval of labels. For the first time this year, we were releasing a cider just over 7%. So we had to submit it for TTB approval. And up until this point, I've always put the harvest year on all of our ciders. It hasn't really been an issue, and it didn't occur to me that it would be an issue, except that the TTB kicked it back, initially saying that could only put the harvest year on if I believe it was over 90% of the fruit came from a single harvest. And then I replied saying that, well, 100% of the fruit came from a single harvest. That's why I put the date on there. And then they kicked it back again, saying, well, you can't put it on there anyway because it's a vintage date and you can only use vintage dating on grape wine. So I reached out to other members of the cider community to see if this was really a thing or if it was just some individual at the TTB kind of not really knowing what they were doing, which happens from time to time. And turns out that, yeah, this has always been a thing for cider over 7%. And you can put dates on all sorts of other alcoholic beverages, on beer, on spirits, and certainly on wine. And you can do it on cider under 7%, but not on cider, mead, or fruit wine that's over 7, which just struck me as ridiculous. And the suggestions from the community were to try to work around this by making it a batch number or putting like packaged in the year, but neither of those things is accurate. The date on the label is the year that the fruit was harvested, which in this case was 2024. The cider wasn't packaged until 2025 because it spent some time in oak barrels. So packaged 2025 is not an accurate statement. It's not lot number 2025, which makes us sound like we're just kind of pumping out massive quantities of cider, which isn't true. It's probably lot number 6 or 7 for us in terms of cider that we've produced overall, with some of those being very, very small batch. But it is harvest year 2024, and I just don't see any rationale behind not allowing us to say that.
Yeah. This sounds like the aha moment was pretty recent then, that you didn't realize that they were not allowing the year that the harvest actually occurred. Is that true? I mean, that's what I'm hearing from
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, that's correct. And that's again because it only really applies to cider that crosses that 7% alcohol by volume mark.
Mm-hmm. Who are the plaintiffs in this case?
It's primarily us, Garden Path Fermentation, and then there's also a consumer plaintiff who is approaching it from the consumer side and saying that this is information that's relevant to consumers and that should be communicated on product labels.
And if there was success, how would you define success coming out of, what are you hoping for at the final end here?
I'm hoping to be able to put truthful and accurate information on our labels and to allow other cider makers and mead makers and fruit wine producers to do the same. I just don't see any reason that that should be restricted or disallowed. There's just no rational argument for it.
Mm-hmm. And what would you see like a label looking like if you're going to win this case here? Would it actually say vintage?
Well, I'll say for my part, personally, I don't really care that much about the use of the word vintage. And we did not use the word vintage on the label that we initially submitted. I know there are some cider makers that have used the word vintage before, and other types of winemakers that use the term vintage. And I don't begrudge them the right to do so by any means. But the more important issue for me is just being able to communicate the harvest year accurately. And if it became necessary to use the word harvest instead of vintage or something along those lines, that's fine as long as we can convey the information. Again, from my standpoint, and there are other cider makers who may feel more strongly about actually using the term vintage.
Mm-hmm. So going back to that question, what would you put on the label then?
The only thing that I put on there was 2024 heirloom blend. And that's all that that's all that I really want to put on there. That 2024 is a very accurate bit of information as to when the apples were grown and the cider was first produced. So I don't see why I shouldn't be allowed to put it there. If, for example, if they developed a policy saying that you could put it there, but it had to say the words harvest year or something like that, that wouldn't be ideal from my standpoint. I think that's certainly implied enough, but it would certainly still be better than the current situation.
Right. And the current situation being that you can't say anything about the actual harvest at all.
No, I mean, you can say in the description on the label that the apples were grown in the 2024 harvest. You could put that in like the small text, but you can't, at least based on current TTB policy, put a year prominently on the label that might be interpreted as a vintage year.
This has been an issue that's been circling around in the cider community for a while, and kind of people feeling pretty grumpy about it, rightly so, that you can't mark when the actual harvest happened because we know each year it changes. Was this a surprise to you, kind of getting into cider? This isn't your first rodeo in fermentation, but cider's a little bit new to your brand. Is that true?
I've been making cider since we started Garden Path in 2018. So it's definitely something that I'm familiar with, and I've worked on the import side of the business with Shelton Brothers Importers for a time, where definitely worked with cider as well. But for whatever reason, this issue hadn't come up before. I think the only ciders where there were vintage years that we ended up dealing with were under 7%, so they didn't fall under TTB jurisdiction. And all the ciders that we produced here at Garden Path were also under 7% in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you mentioned Shelton Brothers. Let's just bring listeners up to date there. I imagine Dan Shelton would have a little bit to say about this issue here, wouldn't he? Having
Oh,
brought
he
it up.
probably would. I haven't actually discussed it with him, and I thought about reaching out. I'll probably send him some info on what we're doing at some point. But yeah, and frankly, I mean, that's a lot of the inspiration here. Dan was certainly a huge mentor to me, and I think, he gets a little bit of pushback for being so litigious, but Dan was doing something that a lot of state and federal laws were just not designed to accommodate, and had to push back in order to be able to do what he was doing and working with very small producers. So yeah, I mean, that was definitely inspirational to me in saying like, hey, if something's not right, challenge it.
Yeah, exactly. As he did with Santa's Butt, right? That was
Yeah.
one of the premier cases that he did bring about. And for folks listening, Dan Shelton is an attorney, and he and his brother Will had Shelton Brothers Importers, and they have a third brother too, and actually based in my territory here in Massachusetts, out of Belchertown. But they have since changed their business model. They've kind of closed that up. But they were really instrumental in bringing beer and then cider into the community here. So yeah, a very good role model indeed. Now, you brought this case forward. I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't been in a lawsuit up to this point. Were you getting any feedback from the community on that, or why folks are sitting on the shelf a little bit on it?
I'm a little surprised by that as well. Honestly, I don't know why nobody had challenged it this way before. I think there was a strong sense of just trying to do it administratively. And I know that the American Cider Association has been pushing for quite some time to resolve this administratively. This isn't actually a law that's on the books. It doesn't say anywhere that cider can't have a vintage, or even specifically that vintage dating can only apply to grape wine. What it says is that in order for a wine to carry a vintage, a certain percentage of the fruit, depending on whether it's within or outside of designated viticultural area, has to come from the same harvest year. But it uses the word grapes. It says that percentage of the grapes have to come from the same harvest year. And the ACA, as I understand it, was trying to push hard for TTB to interpret grapes in that context as just referring to whatever fruit is used to make the wine, and just citing grapes because grape wine is what primarily comes to mind, but not specifically stating that it can't also apply to other types of fruit or other ingredients. And the government really, it has not budged on that. And for that reason, it seemed like this was the only way to really make something happen.
Where is it in the process now? This is, I got a notification. I think Cider Chat broke the news a couple weeks ago, and we heard about it. Where is it in the legal standing right now? What are the next steps that are taking place here? The
Well,
timeline.
we filed the case, and I'm working closely with our attorney, Justin Lee, who's also a former brewery and cidery winery owner himself. He owned Dwinell Country Ales along with his wife, Jocelyn, and they recently shut down production there, so he could go back to his full-time legal practice. But we've worked with Justin before to challenge some other regulations that struck us as unfair, and I reached out to him about this, and he was all for helping us with the challenge on this front. So Justin would be able to speak better than I can as to what the next steps are from a legal standpoint and what the timing of that is going to look like. We're along for the whole thing. And then from our side of things, our label actually hasn't been formally rejected as of yet. They sent it back twice saying needs revision and telling us to remove the vintage year. After the second time that it was kicked back, I resubmitted it saying that it's not a vintage year because the TTB says that vintage years can only apply to grape wine, but it's part of the name of the cider, and it's a truthful and accurate statement of the harvest year. And now it's sitting in this limbo position of hold for research, which I've previously had labels sit in that state for indefinite periods of time. So we're trying to really make something happen here. If the TTB were to come back and say, like, upon further review, sure, it's not a vintage date, but it's truthful and accurate information, and you can put it on the label, and other cider makers can do the same, then I don't know if we would still have a case. I mean, I think that would be the outcome that we're looking for, is to say, okay, you can put harvest year on cider labels, regardless of whether it's called a vintage date or not.
Or whether it's grape or apples, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It seems like a no-brainer. It'd be a really nice, smooth transition if that happens.
And all the feedback that we've gotten so far from the community has been super positive. I mean, we've just gotten so many emails and social media messages and just all sorts of contact phone calls from folks just expressing support, and have yet to receive a single comment in opposition. So whoever's opposed to this, I don't really understand why. I've heard some grumbling that it could be from the grape wine community, but we're also members of the grape wine community, and as members, I feel like this is a positive thing for everyone.
Yeah, I would think so. But sometimes the other side of the aisle kind of sees things differently. Can you help folks who don't really fully understand this in terms of how does banning vintage labeling hurt consumers? Just, maybe that's like a one sentence statement, but it's not just hurting producers, but it's also in reference to consumers too.
Cider is an agricultural product, and if you're making single harvest cider as we are, where all of the fruit is coming from one year, the fruit's going to change from year to year, just as much as the grapes change from year to year in wine. So there's really very little difference in that regard from the impact of a vintage date on a bottle of wine and the impact of a harvest date on a bottle of cider. It's serving the same purpose. It's letting you know. And if a cidery makes a similar blend every year, makes a field blend every year from that year's apples, and they're different from year to year, then being able to talk intelligently about the differences and maybe seek out certain vintages that were exceptional, that applies just as much to cider as it does to wine. And if it's allowed for grapes, why shouldn't it be allowed for apples?
Would you support a defined threshold of like X amount of apples must be from that harvest year, or is this really pushing to have it that vintage year or harvest year be from that particular year, not like a Solera or something like that?
No, I would support that, a definition saying that if you're going to put a year on it, that a certain portion of the apples have to come from that year. That makes sense to me. I think the applying the same, essentially the same rules or parallel rules for cider as wine makes sense. The one caveat on that is that uses viticultural areas, which is something that is very specific to grapes. And there's no equivalent at this point to viticultural areas for cider, and the viticultural areas for grapes don't necessarily apply. So if there were such a thing, then I would say the rules should be the same. If not, then just applying whatever parallel rules we can for cider, or even treating it as non-AVA wine in terms of the rulemaking. I would be fine with that. I mean, for us, it's really just about being able to communicate when the harvest was. And we had done a cider previously below 7% that was a blend of ciders from 2018 and 2019 harvest, and we labeled it as 2018/2019. And I think as long as what you're putting on the label is truthful and accurate, then you should be able to convey the information.
Yeah, I could see that it could get a little sticky if it doesn't become like a really clear definition for makers to follow, whether that those are maybe this happens in the wine world too. You would know more about this than I would, where grapes would be coming from different territories. And that's a little bit what you're speaking about there, right? Like it's pretty defined for grapes, not at this point, not in the US for apples at all, where a maker could be in Michigan bringing apples in from New Hampshire, for instance. Does that impact any of this labeling process? And is that something that in the wine community with grapes that they have to follow?
It's a separate issue, I think, and the I don't really know the history behind why the thresholds are different for grape wines from a single viticultural region versus grape wines that do not qualify for being able to declare themselves as from a single viticultural region. That's, I guess it's my concern to the extent that we're also a winemaker, and we source all of our grapes locally, so our wines generally qualify for Puget Sound AVA, our grape wines, though we're kind of towards the edge of the Puget Sound AVA. So we have had some some grapes that have come from just outside the region as well, where we haven't been able to use that classification. But for our part, if we're putting a vintage year on it, it means that all the fruit came from, or a harvest year, it means that all the fruit came from that harvest. I think, with cider as well as with wine, any regional information also should be accurate. If you're saying like Michigan cider and the apples aren't from Michigan, that's problematic. And I think that, there should be rules around what terminology means. But as far as dates go, if all the fruit came from that harvest, then it really seems pretty self-evident to me that you should be able to say so.
Hmm. What about the percentage piece too? Because you're saying the threshold begins at 7%, right? Now,
7% alcohol by volume.
correct.
Yeah.
And there's many fine ciders that are below that threshold. Would they be able to put vintage on their label now?
Effectively, I think it's a little bit debatable because the TTB doesn't directly regulate those ciders. So arguably the rule still applies, but because it's not regulated by the TTB, there's no one enforcing it because it's not an FDA regulation. FDA doesn't have anything that prohibits use of harvest years or vintage dates on cider or on any type of wine, cider, mead, fruit wine under 7%. So certainly in practical terms, yes, you can absolutely put vintage date on any ciders that are below that 7% mark, which is a thing that we have done in the past with all of our previous cider blends.
This lawsuit is about free speech on labels. Is
Oh,
that
it's 100% about free speech. Yeah, I mean it is a First Amendment suit, and this is not by any means the most offensive example of government overreach by the US federal government, but it's one that we are in a position to push back on and that we want to push back on because it's just there's no reason for it. And the government should be there to protect consumer interests and to protect public interests. And if rules don't do that, if they're there just arbitrarily and aren't really serving anyone's interest, then let's get rid of them.
Yeah, good point. Which is kind of like the reason why consumers should be compelled by this case, or anyone who doesn't know about cider should be compelled about it, because it is all about free speech and our ability to state that as such. So well
Yeah,
done.
I mean that's the question. Whose interest could it possibly serve not to allow us to say 2024 heirloom cider on our 2024 heirloom cider?
Crickets, right? Yeah, I mean, conversely, by not having it on the label, I think it's doing a disservice to consumers. And
Exactly. Yes.
yeah, and they can't sort through it. And anyone who's been out there buying wine, you look at that label and you say, "Oh, that's from 2023. Was that a good year, rainy year?" And all that other information that you get from that just singular statement of the date, which is what I believe what you're doing about this. So I'm wondering, Ron, is there a little bit of a misconception too? You're getting a lot of positive feedback doing this, but maybe from the powers that be, a little bit about bringing a lawsuit like this forward. Any misconceptions that people might have about it, or the reasons behind it?
I really haven't gotten any kind of negative pushback from
Hmm.
anyone so far. So I think that's the only feedback that I've gotten has been positive. I imagine that there are folks at the TTB who are responsible for having to try to defend this ludicrous regulation that might not be all that happy about it, but I haven't heard anything from them. And if they're pushing back, then they should really push back against the higher ups within their administrative branch or within the federal government to just do what they need to do to make this go away and not have it be an issue anymore.
Hmm. And nothing coming from the wine community at all.
Not that I've heard. So if there is pushback from the wine community, I don't know what that is, and I don't know what the basis of it is.
Yeah, yeah. So if this lawsuit succeeds, it's going to have like a reverberation throughout not just your region, but all of the US and certainly beyond for like exporting product overseas.
Well, importing products from overseas that are properly allowed to use vintage labels in their own markets, and then can't do so if they want to send product here.
Right. And you work as a importer, you're still doing that. So
No,
for
I'm not an importer anymore, but we do carry a large range of imported cider, wine, and beer in our shop.
I see. And so to your understanding then, if you're getting a maker in another country and they're bringing the product here, they're needing to change their label and take that off.
Yeah, I mean they would need to put special labeling on to with the US government warning and with other requirements here regardless. but in many cases they can still keep their primary labels. And yeah, this would prohibit producers from being able to use their existing labels, which for a small producer is a huge burden. If you have to print a separate set of labels for another market, that becomes really quite a big expense.
Hmm.
So in effect, it's also preventing consumers from being able to purchase certain products from producers outside the US that are small producers and that are not in a financial position to be able to print entirely separate labels for the US market. It basically means that, well, they can't sell those products here.
Yeah, that's right. I'm wondering, when you were working through the process of, hey, should I bring a lawsuit about, was there a bit of a dialogue of the kind of devil's advocate on one side and looking for those arguments that would prevent like the misuse or like bad actors if vintage becomes allowed? Did you have that kind of brainstorming walking into this, or was it just like, damn it, we can't use vintage and we're going for it?
Uh, Pretty much the latter. Like I reached out to Justin and he's always a great sounding board, being both an attorney and industry or former industry member, just to kind of pick his brain on it to see if he had any insights into why this might be in place. And I reached out to some other cider makers as well, to cider community. I posted on some forums to see, like, does anyone have any insight as to why this is the case, or is there some sort of rationale behind it? And nobody could really explain what even potential rationale there might be. So yeah, challenging it seemed like kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah. And you talked about like you don't really necessarily know what's happening next. Do you have any sense of a timeline?
I really don't. These things tend not to move super quickly. And I think the quickest timeline would be if the government just sees that this really isn't worth defending and we don't have a very good argument to try to defend it, and just puts out a policy statement that makes the whole thing go away. That would be the easiest and quickest resolution. If it has to go through the courts, who knows? It could go through multiple levels of rulings and challenges. If we were to win in lower court, the government might push back and challenge it and then take it to higher courts, and who knows, even Supreme Court at some point. And if we were to lose in lower court, I suspect that we would do the same. So it could be years before we see a resolution on this, but hopefully it'll be sooner.
And where can listeners follow with updates on this case? Where would you direct them to, folks who are keen on this?
Well, certainly following us on our social media at Garden Path WA on Facebook and Instagram, or our website, gardenpathwa.com. We'll post updates as they happen and put out press releases. And hopefully, folks like you will continue to keep an eye on it as well and update your listeners and viewers as there are further developments.
And how can people support? If there's supporters who want to help out there, is there any productive way to do that at this point, do you see, besides calling you and say, go Ron, which
I
is
mean,
nice?
buy cider from small independent cider makers. That's the that's really the best way to support this. And and if you haven't tried some more traditional cider that is tied to single harvests, that is more tied to specific regions, that is more analogous to the way that it's made in ways that are more analogous to how grape wine is made, try some traditional cider. It might surprise you. It's definitely different from a lot of the more modern commercial cider that's out there, where vintage dates might not be as relevant. But just support traditional producers and small producers. That's and ideally including us. Um, that's,
Exactly.
I think, the best way to do it.
Yeah. And you do have an online shop, right?
We do. We're limited in where we can ship. Cider does count as wine, which opens up a few other states where we can ship. I guess it depends state by state. In most states, cider for shipping purposes counts as wine, but we can certainly ship anywhere in Washington and Oregon, and then on a limited basis to some other places as well.
And you're speaking to the makers, you're speaking to the supporters. What would you like to say to regulators out there who are perhaps listening to this conversation right now? Any like one sentence or something you'd like to say to the regulators of the alcohol trade?
what I say to the regulators.
I know I threw you under the
Yeah,
bus
no,
here,
no,
but
it's a tough question. I mean, I guess they to some extent they don't have a lot of leeway, and it's very tempting for us to call up a TTV support line and start yelling at whoever gets on the line. And I admit that I've fallen into that trap once or twice, but I try to be mindful of the fact that they're not necessarily the ones making the decisions. In most cases, they're not. They're hired to follow the guidelines they're given, and they don't have a lot of leeway to step outside of those. But in this instance, the higher ups at the TTB do have some leeway, which they've been pressed to do for years by the ACA. And if they had listened, then this wouldn't be happening. So maybe pay a little bit more attention to folks out there that you're regulating, and be a little bit more cognizant of why these rules may or may not make sense. That would be my message to the regulators out there. And if anyone listening has an explanation for why they believe that this is a good regulation, why we shouldn't be able to call our 2024 heirloom cider a 2024 heirloom cider, I would really welcome that input.
yeah, me too. I'd like to hear what they have to say about that for sure. Well, this is just absolutely fascinating. I'm so excited that it's moving forward, and we'll be watching the lawsuit. And best of luck to Garden Path Fermentation. This is a big step for cider, and hopefully the outcome that you asked, a really smooth transition to, basic no-brainer type of labeling really makes sense. And hopefully it won't be too difficult to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the other message to regulators. Let us convey truthful and accurate information. That's all we're asking to be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Ron. We'll be staying in touch with you and following along, and we applaud you for this, what could be considered a courageous step forward, to be able to do that. And obviously, you're doing it in a big way.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ray. I really appreciate your having me on and giving me the opportunity to tell people about what we're doing here.
Well, a little bit of food for thought, isn't it, Ciderville? You'll find links in the show notes to Garden Path Fermentation at ciderchat.com. Just search for episode 488. And with that, I leave you here. This is Real Wind Caller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
Drink it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we drink it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this. Yeehaw!